March 14, 2003. 3:47 p.m. 15-year-old Jade Harper walks out of Lincoln High School in Chicago. She's done this 1,000 times before. Backpack slung over one shoulder, phone in her pocket, maybe thinking about what she's going to eat for dinner, or the debate tournament coming up, or whether her crush knows she exists. Normal Tuesday afternoon noise. The kind of moment you never remember because nothing is supposed to happen. Except everything happened. By 3:52 p.m. she's gone. Not in the way that matters for a crime show. No screaming, no struggle, no body left behind. Just gone. Erased. Like she stepped through an invisible door and entered a different world, leaving her old one behind. Within hours, her photograph was everywhere. Milk carton material. Television appeals. Her mother's voice breaking on the news. If anyone has seen our Jade, please. We just want her home. That kind of devastation that makes you feel something twist in your stomach, even if you didn't know her. Within days, the police had no answers. Within weeks, the leads evaporated. Within months, Jade Harper became a ghost story, the girl who disappeared, the mystery no one could solve, the cold case that stayed cold. Her parents aged faster than they should have. Her younger brother grew up in the shadow of an absent sister. Her debate coach, Marcus Wells, spent years playing her voice in his head, wondering what he'd missed, what he could have done. 17 years passed. 17 years of nothing. No body. No crime scene. No final answer. Just a family suspended in grief, a city that forgot, and a detective who couldn't let go. And then one night in 2020, everything changed. Marcus Wells, Jade's old debate coach, was listening to a political podcast. Late evening, probably on his phone while winding down. A guest was speaking about political rhetoric, the way language bends and controls and persuades. And as he listened, something happened. His hands went cold. Because he recognized something impossible. Not just the ideas, the pattern. The specific way certain arguments were constructed. The unique rhetorical flourish. The way phrases bent and curved. It was unmistakable. It was Jade. But it wasn't Jade. The guest introduced herself as Morgan Chase, a political commentator and rhetoric expert. Someone completely different. Someone who'd built a life that Jade Harper never could have imagined. Someone who'd been alive this entire time. Someone who'd chosen not to come home. What Marcus Wells didn't know was that he was about to pull a thread that would unravel everything the Harper family thought they knew about loss, about love, about the cost of disappearing. What he didn't know was that the real mystery wasn't where Jade Harper went. The real mystery was why. And the answer would be far more complicated than kidnapping, far more painful than death, and far more human than anyone was prepared for. This is the story of how a girl became a ghost. How a ghost became someone new. And how the truth, when it finally came, was harder to live with than the mystery ever was. Before we go deeper, I need to know where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments. And if cold cases haunt you the way they haunted the town of Chicago, if you want to know what happens when the missing suddenly aren't missing anymore, smash that subscribe button. Because what comes next will change the way you think about disappearance, about survival, and about the thin line between victim and architect of your own fate. Let's begin. Before Jade Harper became a mystery, she was just a girl. But just isn't the right word. Nothing about Jade was ever just anything. Born in 1987, Jade Marie Harper grew up in Chicago's North Shore, in the kind of household where achievement wasn't optional, it was expected. Her father, Robert Harper, was a corporate lawyer. Her mother, Sandra, had put her career on hold to raise her children, but she brought that same intensity to parenting. Excellence was the baseline. Good wasn't good enough. If you were going to do something, you did it right. Jade was naturally inclined to obey that unspoken rule. From age 7, she was reading at a high school level. By 10, she'd won a local speech competition. By 13, she joined the debate team at Lincoln High School, and something clicked inside her. Not in the way it clicked for other kids chasing trophies. For Jade, debate was language. It was architecture. It was the art of building arguments so carefully, so precisely, that when you spoke, people didn't just hear you, they believed you. Her debate coach, Marcus Wells, noticed her immediately. Wells was in his early 50s in 2003, a veteran of the competitive debate circuit, someone who'd coached state champions. He developed an eye for raw talent. On day 1 of the debate team, Jade Harper walked in, quiet, observant, and within 5 minutes, Marcus knew this girl was different. She didn't need coaching, Marcus would later recall. She needed coaching on the fundamentals, sure. But the gift, the ability to deconstruct an argument, to see the threads in another person's logic and pull them until the whole thing unraveled, that wasn't something you could teach. That was something you either had or you didn't. By sophomore year, Jade was competing at state level. Her teammates called her the machine, not as a compliment exactly but as recognition. She would dismantle opponents' arguments with surgical precision. She could make you believe the opposite of what you'd believed 3 minutes before. More than that, she could make you understand why you'd been wrong, which was worse somehow than just winning. But here's what people didn't always see beneath that precision. Jade was isolated. The intelligence that made her extraordinary in debate made her unreachable in the hallways. She wasn't the girl who organized lunch tables. She wasn't the girl who navigated high school social politics with ease. She was the girl sitting alone with a philosophy book, the girl who could make you feel stupid with a single raised eyebrow, the girl who didn't quite fit anywhere. She had a boyfriend, Marcus Chin, a junior who was similarly bookish, similarly intelligent. They understood each other in that way brilliant, lonely people do. But even that relationship carried a quality of performance, of two people who were very good at discussing ideas but less practiced at discussing feelings. Her younger brother, Daniel, was 3 years behind her. Where Jade was intense and controlled, Daniel was more relaxed, more social. Jade loved him fiercely, but she also sometimes seemed like she was observing him from behind glass, present but separate, unable to fully connect. Her parents were proud. Intensely proud. The kind of pride that comes with expectations, with the belief that you've raised someone exceptional. Robert Harper told friends, "Jade's going to do great things. She's going to change the world." Sandra planned for Jade's future like it was a detailed project. Debate competitions leading to speech competitions leading to Ivy League leading to law school or political science or something equally impressive. What neither of them fully understood was that beneath Jade's precision, beneath her rhetorical gifts, beneath her ability to construct complex arguments in real time, there was a girl who was drowning. Not obviously. Not in a way that showed up in grades or tournament results or parent-teacher conferences. But in the smaller moments, the way she would go quiet for hours after school, the way she seemed to retreat into herself, the way she created different versions of herself for different contexts. Debate Jade was sharp and controlled. Family Jade was polite and distant. School Jade was competent. Friend Jade barely existed. There wasn't much of a person there. Years later, a therapist would identify what Jade was doing. Creating personas, rhetorical masks, ways of being that allowed her to disappear into different versions of herself, different ways of speaking and acting and existing that protected her actual self from being exposed. It was a skill that would serve her well in debate. It would destroy her as a person. By early 2003, just months before her disappearance, there were signs that people missed. She was quieter, more withdrawn. There were rumors, never confirmed, about anxiety, about pressure, about a girl who seemed to be fracturing along invisible lines. Some friends noticed. Some teachers noticed. But notice and act are different things and nobody acted. Her mother would later ask again and again, "What did I miss? What could I have done?" The answer, investigators would eventually discover, was more complicated than simple parental failure. The answer was that Jade Harper was brilliant. Brilliant enough to hide how much she was suffering. Brilliant enough to construct a version of herself that looked fine, that performed fine, that seemed like she was fine. And brilliant enough, maybe, to know that the only way to survive was to disappear. But on March 14, 2003, the world still thought Jade Harper was just a remarkable girl with an extraordinary future. Nobody yet knew that she had other plans. 3:15 p.m. Jade Harper is sitting in her 4th period English class at Lincoln High School, somewhere in the middle of a lesson on metaphor in contemporary poetry. She's taking notes. Her handwriting is precise, almost geometric in its accuracy. A girl next to her whispers something. Jade doesn't respond. She's focused. Or she appears to be. 3:38 p.m. The bell rings. Class ends. Jade moves through the hallway with the others, merging into the current of teenagers moving between classes. She's wearing jeans and a gray hoodie, nothing distinctive, nothing that would make her stand out in any crowd. She's holding her backpack in one hand, her phone in the other. She looks like every other sophomore in the building. 3:45 p.m. She texts her mother, "Staying late for debate club practice. We'll be home by 6. It's a routine text. Unremarkable. The kind of message a responsible teenager sends to let her parents know where she is. Sandra Harper receives it while she's at home, probably making dinner or managing something for Daniel. She doesn't worry. This is normal. Jade is always doing something, always pushing herself forward, always adding to her resume, always becoming more. 3:47 p.m. Jade enters the debate practice room. Marcus Wells, her coach, is already there, arranging chairs, setting up materials for the afternoon's work. A handful of other students filter in, maybe 8 or 9 of them. It's a regular practice session. There's nothing remarkable about what happens next. They debate. They argue. They practice refutations and rebuttals. Jade participates. She's sharp as always, and by most accounts she seemed fine, normal, present. 4:15 p.m. Practice ends. Students pack up their things. They head toward the door, toward the parking lot, toward their cars or the bus stop or the walk home. Jade packs her backpack, her homework, her notes, the materials she'll need for tomorrow. She says goodbye to a couple of teammates. She's not angry. She's not upset. She's not visibly distressed. She's just leaving. This is the last clear moment anyone has of seeing Jade Harper in her old life. What happens next exists in fragments. 3 students reported seeing her walking toward the parking lot, heading east. One student said she seemed upset or distracted, though years later, when that student was interviewed again by investigators, she couldn't quite remember what made her think that. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was everything. Another student said she'd seen a blue sedan in the parking lot, a car that didn't belong to any teacher or staff member she recognized. The student thought she saw Jade walking toward it, but the description was vague. The color was maybe blue, maybe gray. The make and model were unknown. The license plate was impossible. This witness memory, interrogated later, fractured under scrutiny. By the time investigators actually tried to follow the lead, it was useless. A third student, one who was also leaving the school, said she definitely saw Jade walking, possibly toward the main road, possibly heading toward the bus stop. But again, memory is unreliable. Certainty crumbles under examination. By 4:30 p.m., Jade Harper had not arrived home. By 5 p.m., her mother called the school. Jade wasn't there. Marcus Wells confirmed that practice had ended at 4:15. No one knew where she'd gone. By 5:30 p.m., Sandra Harper called the police. The dispatcher asked the standard questions. Is she a runaway? Has she run away before? Any signs of trouble at home? Any recent fights or conflicts? Sandra's answer to everything was no. Jade didn't run away. Jade wasn't that kind of girl. Jade was responsible and brilliant and focused. By 6 p.m., police began checking hospitals. They began asking questions. They began very quietly to treat this as a possible emergency. By 8 p.m., a search party was being organized. By 10 p.m., her photograph was being distributed to hospitals, to the police, to anyone who might have seen a 15-year-old girl with dark hair and an unusual intelligence in her eyes. By midnight, the machinery of a missing persons investigation was in full motion. But there was a problem, something that would haunt the investigation for years. There was no crime scene. There was no evidence of abduction, no sign of struggle, no indication that anything violent had happened. Jade Harper had simply not arrived home. She was just gone. The police searched the area around the school. They found her backpack near the east entrance, abandoned near some bushes. Her phone was inside, powered off. Her homework was still in there, her debate notes, her wallet with her driver's license. But no Jade. Where does a 15-year-old girl go when she walks out of school and simply vanishes? And more troubling, why would she leave her phone, her wallet, everything she needed to navigate the world? Either she was taken, forcibly removed from the world she knew, or she'd planned this carefully enough to know that leaving those things behind would make her harder to trace. The investigation would spend the next 17 years trying to answer that question. But the answer was simpler and more complex than anyone imagined. Jade Harper hadn't been taken. She had taken herself. And she was never planning to come back. The first 48 hours of a missing persons case are sacred to investigators. They call it the golden window, the period when memories are fresh, when witnesses haven't had time to reconstruct their recollections, when trails are still warm. In those 48 hours, if a child is found, they're usually found alive. It's not sentiment, it's statistics. After 48 hours, the data becomes darker. Chicago's police department treated Jade Harper's disappearance with appropriate urgency. She was 15, a minor with no history of running away, no history of rebellion, no red flags besides the ordinary complexity of being a brilliant, isolated teenager. The missing persons detective assigned to the case was James Morrison, 30 years on the force, with a reputation for tenacity and an intuition that rarely steered him wrong. Morrison began the way he always did, with interviews. He spoke to Sandra and Robert Harper in their home, watching them carefully, noting their reactions. Were they grieving or performing? Were they hiding something? Morrison's job required him to suspect everyone, including grieving parents. But what he saw in the Harper household was genuine devastation. Robert was nearly catatonic. Sandra moved like someone operating on emergency power, functioning because she had to function, not because she had any real hope. Morrison interviewed Marcus Wells, Jade's debate coach. Wells gave a detailed account of the practice, of Jade's demeanor, of nothing unusual happening until she simply left at the end like she always did. Morrison noted that Wells seemed deeply affected, not panicked but shaken. This man cared about this girl, cared about her in the way good teachers do. Morrison interviewed Jade's boyfriend, Marcus Chin. The second Marcus in her life. Marcus Chin was distraught, a quiet, intelligent boy who'd been dating the girl for 3 months, who thought he might love her, who was now spiraling in a way that Morrison recognized, the special agony of teenage loss. Morrison ruled him out quickly. This boy hadn't done anything except care about her. Morrison interviewed the friends who'd seen her leaving school. He tried to nail down details. He showed them photographs. He asked them to focus, to remember, to be certain. But witness testimony is poison. It's poison because it's human, because human memory is fallible and suggestible and easily corrupted. By the second or third interview, the students who'd seen something couldn't quite remember what anymore. Within the first 24 hours, search parties had mobilized across Chicago. Volunteers combed neighborhoods. The media picked up the story. A missing teenage girl, middle-class family, no obvious signs of foul play, which meant either an abduction or a runaway. The television news was hungry for it. Jade's photograph was everywhere. Beautiful in that particular way intelligent girls are, not conventionally pretty but striking, intimidating even in a still frame. Her mother appeared on television. Sandra Harper sat next to her husband, composed in the way people are when they're barely holding together, and made a plea. If anyone has seen our Jade, please contact the police. We just want her home. Jade, if you're watching this, please know that we love you. Please come home. It was devastating. It was the kind of thing that makes viewers feel things, that makes the community rally. Tips began flooding in. A girl matching Jade's description had been spotted at a bus station across town. Another sighting at the airport. Another in a diner 3 hours away. The police chased each lead with intensity, desperate for the golden window to produce results. But each lead evaporated. The bus station girl wasn't Jade. The airport girl wasn't Jade. The diner girl wasn't Jade. With each false positive, the urgency shifted. If she wasn't at the bus station, where was she? If she wasn't at the airport, where was she going? By hour 36, a troubling question began to form in the detective's mind. Morrison, sitting in the school's parking lot late on March 15th, looking at the spot where Jade's backpack had been found, asked himself something he hadn't asked before. What if this isn't an abduction? What if this is a girl who ran away so cleanly, so completely, that she didn't even take the things that would identify her? It was a disturbing thought. It suggested agency. It suggested planning. It suggested that Jade Harper, for reasons no one understood, had decided that her life, her family, her school, her identity, was something she needed to escape from. The gold window was closing. By hour 48, the investigation had to shift tactics. They would now be looking not just for a kidnapped girl, but for a missing girl who might have chosen to disappear. They would be looking for pattern and motive and the kind of evidence you can't find on the side of the road. What Morrison didn't know, what no one knew, was that he was already looking in the wrong place entirely. Within a week, Jade Harper's disappearance had a mythology all its own. The debate community, being relatively tight-knit and competitive, was the first place theories metastasized. Some whispered that she'd been kidnapped by someone who'd seen her compete, a predator obsessed with her intelligence, with her gift for rhetoric. This theory felt dark and real and terrifying in the way that internet forums in the early 2000s made everything feel real. People who'd never met Jade became invested in her story, spinning narratives, building psychological profiles of imaginary perpetrators. Others, particularly in the school itself, whispered different stories. The girl had been too isolated, too intense. Maybe she'd killed herself? The whispers said depression, said undiagnosed anxiety, said a brilliant mind breaking under invisible pressure. Maybe her body was in the river. Maybe she'd taken pills and was lying in the woods somewhere. These were speculation, gossip, the casual cruelty of teenagers constructing tragedies they didn't fully understand. The school's rumor mill worked overtime. Teachers were suspect for a brief moment. The debate coach, Marcus Wells, was scrutinized more closely than necessary, his interaction with students examined under a microscope. There was nothing, no evidence of anything inappropriate, but for several weeks, there was an awkwardness in the debate room. Parents began asking questions. The school had to release statements. No foul play suspected involving staff. But suspicion once planted grows like a weed. One particular rumor took hold, that Jade had run away because her parents were abusive. This myth developed almost spontaneously the way urban legends do. The story went that Robert and Sandra Harper had pushed too hard, demanded too much, created a girl so perfect on the surface that she had no choice but to fracture underneath. It was a compelling narrative. Two strict parents, brilliant but traumatized daughter, desperate escape. The only problem was that it wasn't really true. But truth doesn't matter much in the machinery of gossip. Another contingent believed she'd been taken by human traffickers, a girl beautiful and intelligent and isolated enough to be vulnerable. This theory felt real because trafficking was a real problem, because it happened, because the mechanism for it existed. The police investigated this angle. They consulted with trafficking specialists. They looked for interstate connections, for networks, for patterns. They found nothing. The media, operating on a different timeline than the police, began cycling through narrative possibilities. First, it was missing teen, community rallies, a story about unity and hope. Then, as days became weeks, it shifted to investigation stalls on vanished girl, a story about bureaucratic failure and frustrated police work. Then, as weeks became months, the story simply became background noise, one of many mysteries the city collectively forgot about. By month 6, Jade Harper was no longer on the news. By year 1, most of the city had moved on entirely. But for those close to her, she never really left. Marcus Wells, her debate coach, kept her files. He kept her tournament recordings. He kept the notes she'd made on debate strategies, her handwriting precise as always. Years later, he would tell people, "I never stopped thinking about her. I'd be teaching another student with the same gift and I'd see Jade's face. I'd hear her voice. It was like she was haunting the debate room, like she was still there even though she was gone." Her brother, Daniel, grew up under the shadow of her absence. The missing sister defined his childhood, his teenage years. His identity was partially constructed around being Jade Harper's brother, the girl who disappeared. He wondered if he was supposed to carry her forward, if he was supposed to become the person she would have been. He struggled with that weight his entire adolescence. Her parents cycled through hope and despair on an annual schedule. Every anniversary of her disappearance, Sandra would contact the police, would beg for updates, would press for new investigations. Robert threw himself into work in a way that suggested avoidance, perhaps guilt. They attended therapy. They gave interviews. They became the parents of a missing girl, and that identity never quite released them. But in the community at large, Jade Harper became something else entirely, a cautionary tale. A girl who was too smart for her own good. A warning about pushing teenagers too hard. A tragedy that somehow justified itself, that fit neatly into narratives people already believed about ambition and perfectionism and the dangers of being different. Nobody, in all those years of speculation and theory and collective mythology, seemed to consider the simplest explanation. That Jade Harper had looked at her life and decided she didn't want it anymore. That she'd made a choice. That she'd chosen to be born again as someone else. Nobody imagined that she was alive, thriving, building a completely different version of herself in a completely different city, under a completely different name. Nobody could have imagined that she would eventually speak her truth on a podcast, where her old coach would recognize her voice like a ghost voice from his past. Because mystery is always more satisfying than complexity. And people would rather believe in tragedy than in the harder truth, that sometimes, survival looks like betrayal. James Morrison was 53 years old when Jade Harper disappeared. He had 16 more years until retirement. 16 years that should have been winding down, years of coasting, of doing the job but not being consumed by it. He had a marriage that was stable if not passionate, a daughter in college, a house that needed less work than it was getting. He had a comfortable trajectory: solve a few cases, mentor some younger detectives, retire with a pension and a watch, disappear into whatever came next. Jade Harper changed that trajectory in ways Morrison couldn't have predicted. It started normally enough. She was a case and he was a detective, and he did what detectives do. He investigated. He interviewed. He followed leads. But somewhere around week 3, Morrison realized something. This case wasn't resolving. The leads weren't panning out. The narrative wasn't clarifying. Instead, the more he investigated, the more complex she became. He began reading her materials obsessively. Her journal, provided by her parents. Her debate competition recordings. Her school assignments. Her yearbook photos. He was trying to understand her, trying to see inside the girl she'd been, trying to determine whether she was a victim or an architect of her own disappearance. What he found was complexity that didn't fit neatly into either category. Jade's journal was fragmented, written in a careful, controlled hand. She wrote about debate strategy and philosophy readings and observations about her classmates that were devastatingly perceptive. But there was also absence in the journal. She never wrote about feelings in a direct way. She never admitted vulnerability. She constructed everything as intellectual observation. Robert and Sandra continue to express investment in my future, she wrote, when most teenagers would write my parents won't leave me alone about college. Morrison consulted with a psychologist. The psychologist noted the dissociative quality of her writing, the way she seemed to observe her own life from the outside, the creation of personas, the fragmentation of self. She's constructing barriers, the psychologist said. She's protecting something underneath. By year 2 of the investigation, Morrison was working the Jade Harper case on his own time. His captain had suggested, gently, that he move on. Other cases needed attention. But Morrison couldn't let go. He attended debate competitions just to watch the team that had been hers. He befriended Marcus Wells, her coach, and they would spend hours talking about the girl they'd both known in different ways. Marcus talked about her gift for rhetoric. Morrison talked about her gift for disappearing. By year 5, Morrison's marriage had fractured under the weight of his obsession. His wife, Barbara, left him. She was patient at first, understanding that cases could consume a detective's life. But Morrison's consumption of the Jade Harper case was different. It wasn't professional. It was personal. He was haunted in a way she didn't understand. "You're treating this like she was your daughter," Barbara told him before she left. "Someone has to," Morrison said back. By year 10, Morrison had filled an entire room in his house with case materials. Photographs, documents, timelines, maps of the city, interviews transcribed and annotated. He'd interviewed some people multiple times. He tracked down family friends, old teachers, anyone who'd known Jade. He was building a portrait of a girl, trying to understand her, trying to figure out why she disappeared. His colleagues noticed. They were concerned. A couple of them suggested, carefully, that Morrison might want to talk to someone professionally. But Morrison was stable enough to function at work. He was eccentric, sure, but not dangerous. They left him alone. By year 15, Detective James Morrison was the only person in the Chicago Police Department who still actively thought about Jade Harper. She wasn't on the active case list anymore. She was a cold case, a missing person who would likely remain missing. The official investigation had concluded, not solved but concluded. There wasn't enough new evidence to justify continued resource allocation. But Morrison hadn't stopped. He'd subscribed to databases that tracked potential sightings. He'd created profiles of where she might be, what she might be doing, how she might have built a new identity. He'd become, in some sense, her ghost, following her not through the world, but through the traces she'd left behind in records and documents and the memories of people who'd known her. What Morrison didn't know was that he was looking in the wrong direction. He was trying to find the evidence of her escape, when the evidence had been there all along, not in the physical world but in the digital one. Not in Chicago but somewhere else entirely. Not as the girl she'd been but as the woman she'd become. He was 17 years away from hearing her voice on a podcast and understanding, finally, that the girl he'd been looking for had never really been missing. She'd just been somewhere else entirely, becoming someone new. And when that moment finally came, all of Morrison's obsession, all of his years of searching, all of his desperate need to understand, would finally crystallize into something that looked like an answer. But answers, Morrison would learn, are never as simple as they seem. Years pass differently when you're waiting for someone to come home. Normal years are measured in seasons. Winter becomes spring, becomes summer. But when someone you love is missing, years become something else. They become markers of stagnation. They become evidence of abandonment. They become proof that the person you're waiting for has chosen not to return. For the Harper family, years 1 through 17 were an extended suspension. Not quite grief, because grief requires a body, a finality. Not quite hope, because hope requires the possibility of reunion. Instead, it was a kind of limbo, the family existing in a state of permanent incompleteness, shaped entirely around the absence of one girl. Sandra Harper's transformation was the most visible. The photographs from 2003 show a woman in her early 50s, professional, composed, with the kind of determined beauty that comes from taking care of yourself. The photographs from 2010 show someone older, someone whose face had rearranged itself around sorrow. By 2015, by 2018, by 2020, Sandra looked like a woman who'd spent 17 years fighting an enemy she couldn't locate. She gave interviews on the anniversaries. Every March 14th, the local news would call, and Sandra would appear on camera, older each time, her voice becoming increasingly hollow. We still don't know what happened to Jade. We're still hoping she comes home. We still hold out hope. By year 15, the interviews felt like performance, the going through of motions because stopping would mean accepting that Jade was never coming home. Robert Harper took a different path. He threw himself into work with an intensity that bordered on manic. If he could build something, if he could create something, maybe it would fill the hole that Jade's absence had carved out of his life. He was promoted. He made more money. He built wealth with the kind of single-mindedness that suggests he was running from something rather than toward it. Daniel Harper, the younger brother, grew up in the shadow of a sister he barely remembered. His childhood was retroactively defined by her absence. Other kids asked about her. Teachers knew his face because they'd known hers. His teenage years were spent in the background of his sister's mystery. He developed a certain protective rage about it, anger at Jade for disappearing and leaving him to inherit her absence, anger at his parents for never quite letting him be his own person, anger at the world for turning his sister into a cold case instead of a sister. By adulthood, he had complicated feelings about who Jade even was. He had memories of her, but they were filtered through the lens of her disappearance. Was she the person he remembered, or was she the ghost story? Were his feelings real memories or reconstructed ones, bent to fit the narrative of loss? The city of Chicago itself forgot. Jade Harper's photographs cycled off the news. New missing persons cases emerged, took their turns in the spotlight, were solved or became cold cases themselves. The machinery of missing people churned on, and Jade Harper became something historical, something that happened, something people barely remembered unless prompted. But in the quiet corners of Chicago, in Marcus Wells's classroom, in the Harper household, in Detective Morrison's office at home, Jade Harper never left. She was the girl who disappeared. The girl who was missing. The girl who haunted everyone who'd known her, not like a ghost but like an unanswered question, like a problem that refused to be solved, like a mystery that kept people awake at night. By 2015, the case was officially cold. By 2018, no one at the police department expected it to be solved. By 2019, Detective Morrison was retired, living with the obsession he'd carried for nearly 2 decades, still wondering where Jade Harper was, still unable to let her go. And then, in 2020, something happened that no one expected, that no one had prepared for, that would shatter 17 years of silence. A woman in Portland, Oregon, was invited to speak on a podcast. December 2020. A political podcast called The Rhetoric of Power has been running for 6 years. It's moderately successful, a few 100,000 regular listeners, the kind of show people listen to while commuting or exercising or doing dishes. The hosts debate current events, analyze political rhetoric, bring in guests to discuss the mechanics of persuasion and language. This particular episode, released on a Tuesday evening, featured a guest speaker named Morgan Chase. Morgan Chase is a political commentator and rhetoric analyst based in Portland. She's built a quiet career analyzing the language of political discourse, writing occasional op-eds, appearing on podcasts. She's not famous. She's not a household name. She's the kind of expert that people encounter in the background, credible, intelligent, articulate, but not memorable in the way that famous people are. The episode topic was The Rhetoric of Control, How Language Shapes Political Reality. Morgan Chase was articulate about the subject. She discussed the mechanisms by which certain political figures constructed arguments, the way language could be weaponized to shape perception, the way rhetoric itself could become a form of power. She cited philosophers and political theorists. She constructed arguments with precision, deconstructed opposing viewpoints with surgical care, moved between abstract theory and concrete examples with ease. It was a good episode. Not exceptional. Just good. Somewhere in Portland, Morgan Chase finished recording, packed up her things, went home to her apartment and didn't think much about it. It was another podcast appearance. Another opportunity to discuss her area of expertise. Another small contribution to the broader conversation about language and politics. But in Chicago, something was happening that would change everything. Marcus Wells was listening. Wells was in his early 70s by 2020. He was retired from teaching, living a quieter life, but he still listened to debate-adjacent content. He still cared about rhetoric. He still spent his evenings consuming intellectual content, still maintained the habits of someone who'd spent his career thinking about language. He was doing dishes when he heard the podcast. The episode was streaming through speakers in his kitchen. He was half paying attention, engaged but not intensely, listening to the hosts introduce their guest. And then Morgan Chase started speaking. Something happened inside him. It wasn't immediate recognition, Not like seeing a face in a crowd and knowing instantly who it was. It was something slower, something that built gradually as he listened. The way she constructed sentences. The specific rhythm of her argumentation. A particular turn of phrase that she used when she was making a central point. The way her voice shifted registers, from analytical to passionate and back again. Marcus stopped doing dishes. He turned up the volume. He listened to Morgan Chase explain political rhetoric for 20 minutes, and with every minute that passed he became more and more certain of something impossible. He knew this person. He'd coached this person. He'd heard this voice construct arguments in a debate room in Chicago 17 years ago. "Oh my God," he said aloud, though he was alone in his kitchen. He finished the episode. He replayed it. He listened again, paying closer attention to every word, every pattern, every distinctive element of her speech. And with each listen he became more certain. The woman on the podcast was Jade Harper. But the woman on the podcast was named Morgan Chase. The woman on the podcast was a 32-year-old living her life in Portland, Oregon, as if she'd never been missing, as if she'd never disappeared, as if she'd never been a headline in Chicago. Marcus sat down. His hands were shaking. He called his wife. "I need to tell you something that's going to sound insane." He contacted Marcus Wells's old debate records. He dug out old tournament tapes. He listened to Jade Harper's voice from 20 years ago, a teenage girl competing at state level, her voice younger but the patterns unmistakable. By the time he'd finished his investigation he was certain. Absolute. The woman speaking on the podcast about political rhetoric was the girl who disappeared in 2003. He had a choice to make. He could remain silent, protecting this woman's privacy, respecting her choice to disappear and build a new life. Or he could tell someone. He could bring Jade Harper back from the dead, metaphorically speaking. He could end 17 years of mystery and suffering for a family that had been destroyed by not knowing. What Marcus Wells didn't know was that he couldn't choose between those two options. By choosing to speak, he would do both things simultaneously. He would answer a question that had haunted Chicago for 17 years. And he would shatter the life that a woman named Morgan Chase had carefully built. The irony, the devastating irony, was that by trying to help a family find the girl they'd lost, he would force that girl to confront the person she'd abandoned. He didn't know it yet, but Marcus Wells was about to become the catalyst for the most complicated reunion in the history of missing persons cases. A case where the victim didn't want to be found. Where the missing person was thriving. Where the resolution would be far messier than the mystery. He called Detective James Morrison first. Detective James Morrison had been retired for 4 years. He was living a quiet life, the kind of life that felt uncomfortable after decades of intensity. He was sleeping better than he had in years, though the Jade Harper case still visited him in dreams. He volunteered occasionally at a local youth center. He was trying in small ways to build a life that wasn't defined by unsolved mysteries. When Marcus Wells called him, Morrison's first reaction was skepticism. "Marcus, listen to me. These kinds of coincidences, they feel real but they're usually not. We see what we want to see in voices. Memory is unreliable." "Listen to the tape," Wells said. Morrison listened. And something shifted inside him. He didn't want to acknowledge it, but he heard it. He heard the patterns he'd spent 17 years studying. He heard the voice of a girl he'd never met but had spent years trying to understand. "If this is real," Morrison said carefully, "we need to verify it before we do anything. We can't just accuse someone of being a missing person without solid evidence." Morrison contacted the Chicago Police Department. He spoke to detectives who were actively working, who had forensic tools he'd used back in 2003 but which had evolved significantly. Together, they began the process of building a case that Morgan Chase was actually Jade Harper. They started with podcast registrations. The show's producer had payment information, records of who'd been invited and when. They had Morgan Chase's name associated with a particular social security number, which was tied to a particular address in Portland. From there, they began building a digital profile. Tax records showed that Morgan Chase had filed taxes for the first time in 2005, 2 years after Jade Harper disappeared. Before that, nothing. No records. No digital footprint. But in 2005, Morgan Chase emerged as a complete person. Someone with a social security number, an address, a tax filing history. It was a clean birth, the kind of new identity that suggested either forged documents or someone being added to the system after previously existing off the grid. They obtained a photograph from a podcast event, a professional photo of Morgan Chase speaking at a conference. They aged photos of Jade Harper using facial recognition software, creating what Jade would look like at 32. The match was compelling but not conclusive. They listened to more podcast episodes, comparing Morgan's voice patterns to archived debate recordings from Lincoln High School. A forensic linguist, yes, such a thing exists, analyzed the patterns, the word choices, the specific rhetorical structures. The conclusion, the probability that these were the same person was extraordinarily high. But probability isn't certainty. What they needed was DNA confirmation or a direct admission or some other concrete proof. And that meant approaching Morgan Chase. The decision to contact her wasn't simple. She was a legal adult. She'd committed no crime. She had the right to be anonymous, to have changed her name, to have built a new identity. The police couldn't simply force her to take a DNA test or admit who she was. But they could approach her. They could tell her what they'd discovered. They could give her the opportunity to confirm or deny. Detective Sarah Chin, one of the younger detectives who'd inherited pieces of the Jade Harper case over the years, was assigned to make contact. Chin was careful about the approach. She wasn't accusatory. She was gentle, professional, treating Morgan Chase like she was doing her a favor by giving her the chance to tell her story before the media got wind of it. The initial contact was through email. Miss Chase, I'm Detective Sarah Chen with the Chicago Police Department. We've been investigating a missing persons case from 2003, and we've recently developed new information that may be connected to you. Would you be willing to speak with us? This is not an accusation, it's an inquiry. If you're willing to speak with us, we can arrange a conversation at your convenience. Morgan Chase, or Jade Harper depending on which name you used, didn't respond for 3 days. Then she called the detective. Her voice was controlled, but beneath the control, Detective Chen could hear fear. What do you want? She asked. I want to understand your story, Chen said. I want to hear it from you. Because I've got a family in Chicago who's been waiting 17 years for an answer, and you might be that answer. But I want you to tell me what happened, not the newspapers, not anyone else. You. There was a long silence. Then, if I talk to you, what happens to me? Nothing happens to you, Chen said carefully. You're not accused of anything. You didn't commit a crime. If you're the person we think you were a traumatized teenager who made a choice. I'm not here to punish you. I'm here to bring closure to people who've been living in uncertainty. Morgan Chase agreed to a video call. 3 days later, sitting in a Portland lawyer's office. Yes, she had a lawyer present. The woman known as Morgan Chase confirmed that she was Jade Harper. She didn't deny it. She didn't deflect. She simply said, yes. I was Jade Harper. I'm not anymore. What happened next was the strangest reunion in the history of missing persons investigations. The woman who called herself Morgan Chase and used to be Jade Harper sat across from Detective Sarah Chin, with her lawyer beside her and a camera recording everything. She was composed in a way that suggested decades of practice in controlling her presentation. But beneath the composure there was something else. Exhaustion, maybe, or resignation, or the particular weariness that comes from keeping a secret for 17 years. Detective Chen asked the fundamental question, why did you disappear? And Jade Harper, because that's who she was when she answered, the girl beneath the name change, began to tell her story. I was drowning, she said. At 15, I was drowning in ways nobody could see because I was very good at hiding. I was good at constructing the versions of myself that people needed to see. For my parents, I was the brilliant daughter who was going to do extraordinary things. For my coaches, I was the debate prodigy. For my teachers, I was the perfect student. For my friends, if I'd had real friends, I would have been whatever they needed. But underneath all of those versions, there was someone disappearing. There was someone fragmenting into pieces. She described her life before the disappearance as a performance, a carefully constructed series of personas that had nothing to do with who she actually was. She described the pressure, not explicit but deeply felt, to be extraordinary, to achieve, to validate the choices her parents had made in raising her to be exceptional. They didn't do anything wrong, she said. That's the complicated part. They loved me. They were proud of me. But they loved and were proud of the version of me that I was performing. They didn't know the real me because the real me was scared and anxious and desperate and fundamentally broken in ways I couldn't articulate. She described the isolation of being different, intellectually, emotionally, socially. She described having a boyfriend she cared about but couldn't connect with on any real level because she didn't know how to be authentic with anyone. She described Debate Club as a space where she could excel but also as a space that demanded she be even more controlled, even more precise, even more perfectly articulate than she already was. By early 2003 I was dissociating, she said. That's what a therapist told me later. I was constructing so many versions of myself, so many personas, that the actual self was completely fractured. I would go through days and barely remember them. I was present but not present. I was performing being alive rather than actually being alive. The decision to disappear, she said, didn't come as a sudden break but as a slow realization. It started as a thought. What if I just didn't come home? What if I just walked away from all of it? And the more I thought about it, the more real it felt. Not as fantasy but as a possibility. As a choice. She described March 14, 2003, as the day she finally chose to act on that thought. I planned it carefully. I'd been saving money from debate tournament prize money. I had enough to get on a bus and survive for a few weeks. I had enough to figure out what came next. When I left debate practice that day, I made a choice. I didn't run because I was being chased. I ran because staying was going to destroy me. She described the early days, taking a bus to another state, sleeping in cheap motels, figuring out how to exist without a legitimate identity. She admitted to forging documents, to working under the table, to the gray spaces of survival. I wasn't proud of it, she said. But I was alive. For the first time in my life, I was actually alive. I wasn't performing. I was just being. Making mistakes, learning, existing in real time. It was terrifying and beautiful and the only thing that saved my life. Eventually, she built legitimacy. She got a real social security number. She was vague about how. She went to a different college in a different state. She chose a new name, Morgan Chase, because it felt like a name for someone new, someone who wasn't haunted by expectations, someone who could be built from scratch. I became the person I should have been able to become in Chicago, she said. I became someone who could have experiences without performing them. Someone who could fail without the world ending. Someone who was allowed to be imperfect. When asked about her family, her voice changed. It became tighter, more controlled. I know what I did to them, she said. I know what my disappearance meant to my mother, to my father, to Daniel. And I'm sorry for that pain. I'm genuinely sorry. But I wasn't capable of calling them. I wasn't capable of sending a message. Because if I contacted them, I would be admitting that I was alive and chose not to come home. And if I did that, the pull to return would be too strong. I would go back and I would die. Not physically. But I would become Jade Harper again and I would die. The lawyer interjected at one point, but Morgan raised her hand. No, it's okay, she said. They deserve to hear this. They've been waiting 17 years. The least I can do is tell the truth. She addressed the camera directly then, speaking as if to the Harper family, though they weren't in the room. I became someone new because I had to. I'm sorry for the person I left behind. I'm sorry for the daughter I couldn't be. But I can't apologize for saving myself. And I need you to understand that those two things are true at the same time. I caused you pain and I had to do it to survive. Both things are real. When she finished, there was a long silence in the room. Detective Chin asked, "What happens now?" Morgan Chase, still Jade Harper but less so than before, looked at her lawyer then back at the camera. Now the world finds out I've been alive the entire time. Now my family has to process that. Now I have to decide what happens to the life I've built. That's what happens now. The Harper family found out through a phone call from Detective Chin. Sandra Harper was in her kitchen, making dinner like she'd made dinner every night for 17 years when the phone rang. At first, when the detective said, "We found your daughter," Sandra didn't understand. She thought they meant her body. She thought they'd finally found Jade, and the grief that had been held in suspension for 17 years was about to transform into a different kind of grief. Then Chin explained, "Your daughter is alive. She's in Portland, Oregon. She's been alive the entire time." The reaction wasn't joy. It was confusion, shock, a disorientation that was almost worse than the original disappearance. Sandra sat down. She couldn't process what she was being told. Jade was alive? Jade had chosen to disappear? Jade had spent 17 years building a different life, a different name, a different identity? Robert Harper's reaction was different. It was anger, a white-hot rage at this revelation. His daughter had been alive. She'd been alive and thriving and building a career, and she hadn't called, hadn't sent a message, hadn't offered any indication that she still existed in the world. Daniel Harper's reaction was perhaps the most complicated. He'd grown up defined by his sister's absence. He'd built his entire childhood and adolescence around the missing girl. Now suddenly she wasn't missing. She'd never been missing. She'd simply chosen a different life, and in doing so, she'd chosen to exclude him entirely from her future. The family didn't immediately reach out to Morgan Chase. They needed to process it first. They needed to accept that their missing daughter wasn't missing at all, just absent in a way that was somehow more devastating than death would have been. When Sandra finally called, 3 weeks later, her voice was trembling. "Is this Morgan? Are you Jade? I'm both, Morgan said quietly. But I understand if you don't see it that way. The conversation was strained. Sandra asked questions that had no good answers. Why didn't you ever contact us? Why couldn't you have sent us even a single message saying you were alive? And Morgan tried to explain, but explanations felt like excuses, even when they were true. Because if I contacted you, I would become your daughter again. And I couldn't be your daughter. I could only survive if I was completely separated from being Jade. Sandra didn't understand. Perhaps she couldn't understand. Perhaps a mother is supposed to matter more than survival, and the fact that Jade had chosen survival over motherhood was too fundamental a betrayal to ever really process. Robert didn't call her at all. His anger was too complete, too all-consuming. His daughter had been alive and she hadn't cared enough to come home. That was how he interpreted it, and no explanation would change his interpretation. Daniel called, and that conversation was the most honest of all. I don't know who you are, he said. You're my sister, but I don't know you. I grew up because you disappeared. I became who I am because of your absence. And now I'm supposed to just accept that you were alive the whole time? That's too much. I can't do that. I understand, Morgan said. I'm sorry. Don't apologize, Daniel said. Just acknowledge that you hurt us. Don't explain it away. Don't justify it. Just say, I hurt you and that was the cost of my survival. I hurt you, Morgan said. And that was the cost of my survival. There was a long silence. I can live with that, Daniel said finally. I don't like it, but I can live with it. The Harper family attempted what could loosely be called a reunion. Morgan flew to Chicago and they met in a neutral location, a therapist's office, because none of them could figure out how to do this on their own. The reunion was not warm. It was tense, awkward, full of the kind of tension that comes when people who are biologically connected are emotional strangers. Sandra couldn't stop staring at her daughter, looking for the girl she'd lost 17 years ago, seeing someone new instead. Robert barely spoke. Daniel asked pointed questions about the years away, trying to understand the person his sister had become. Morgan answered everything calmly, without defensiveness. She'd had 17 years to build emotional walls. She knew how to control her presentation, how to give people what they needed to hear while protecting herself from full exposure. By the end of the session, no one felt healed. But they all agreed to continue trying. The family fractured further in the months that followed. Robert and Sandra's marriage, already strained by the years of grief, broke under the weight of this new trauma. Some members of the family eventually reached a kind of fragile peace with Morgan's presence. Others maintained distance, unable to reconcile the girl they'd lost with the woman she'd become. What was clear was this: Jade Harper's disappearance had harmed not just the girl herself, but everyone connected to her. And her return didn't heal those harms. It just transformed them into something different, something that required active processing instead of passive mourning. The mystery was solved. The case was closed. But the damage, it turned out, didn't close when the case did. Detective James Morrison sat in his living room, watching the news coverage of the Jade Harper case being solved. It was surreal in a way he hadn't expected. He'd spent 17 years? Well, Morrison had spent 17 years, looking for answers. And now that he had an answer, he didn't know how to feel about it. He'd expected closure. Instead, he found complexity. I was looking for a victim, Morrison said in an interview months later. I was looking for a crime. I was looking for someone who'd been taken against their will. But the real victim was the girl herself. A girl who was slowly disappearing in real time, who needed to escape, who saw disappearing as the only path to survival. That's not a crime story. That's a tragedy story. And I didn't know how to process that. Morgan Chase, the name she kept, the identity she'd built, continued her life in Portland. She returned to podcasting, but now with a different kind of visibility. She was the woman who'd disappeared, the cold case that was solved, the girl who'd chosen to disappear and become someone new. Some listeners celebrated her. Others condemned her. Most were simply curious, trying to understand what it meant to disappear and become, to choose survival over obligation. I'm grateful that my story is out, she said in an interview. Because maybe it helps other people understand that sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is leave. Sometimes staying is cruelty to yourself. I'm not proud of how I did it. I'm not proud of the pain I caused. But I'm proud that I survived. That I became someone who could actually live instead of just perform. The case of Jade Harper's disappearance raises questions that have no easy answers. At what point does someone have the right to disappear? What are the obligations we have to people who love us? And do those obligations ever supersede our need for survival? Is the person who disappears always a victim, or can they also be an architect of their own escape? And when someone who's been lost is finally found, should the reunion be joyful, or does the complexity of the situation make that impossible? These are questions that philosophers and therapists and families everywhere have to grapple with. The case was closed by official standards. The mystery was solved, the missing person was found, but in another sense the case was never solved at all. Because the real questions were never forensic. They were deeply, fundamentally human. Detective Sarah Chin, who conducted the final interviews, concluded, "This case taught me that not all disappearances are crimes. Some are acts of survival. Some are people trying to break free from lives that are suffocating them. And sometimes when we find the missing person, they don't want to be found. And that's the most difficult truth of all." In the end, the story of Jade Harper is a story about the complexity of human choice. It's a story about a girl who was drowning and made a choice to save herself, even if that choice meant hurting everyone who loved her. It's a story about survival and cost and the way that sometimes the person who disappears is trying to stay alive, not trying to hurt the people left behind. The mystery is solved. Jade Harper is alive. She's in Portland, building a life, continuing her work as Morgan Chase, processing the reunion with her family, trying to figure out how to live as someone who is both a victim and a survivor, both a daughter and someone who had to leave her daughter nest behind. And Detective Morrison, the man who spent 17 years obsessed with finding her, finally has his answer. But answers, he learned, are rarely as satisfying as we hope they'll be. "I found the girl," Morrison said. "But in finding her, I learned that sometimes the most important discoveries don't bring closure. They bring understanding. And understanding is heavier in its way than mystery ever was." This is the story of Jade Harper. A girl who disappeared. A woman who emerged. And the complicated truth that sometimes the missing don't want to be found, and the found don't want to come home. Morgan Chase, the name she kept, the identity she'd built, continued her life in Portland. She returned to podcasting, but now with a different kind of visibility. She was the woman who'd disappeared, the cold case that was solved, the girl who'd chosen to disappear and become someone new. Some listeners celebrated her. Others condemned her. Most were simply curious, trying to understand what it meant to disappear and become, to choose survival over obligation. "I'm grateful that my story is out," she said in an interview. "Because maybe it helps other people understand that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is leave. Sometimes staying is cruelty to yourself. I'm not proud of how I did it. I'm not proud of the pain I caused. But I'm proud that I survived. That I became someone who could actually live instead of just perform." The case of Jade Harper's disappearance raises questions that have no easy answers. At what point does someone have the right to disappear? What are the obligations we have to people who love us, and do those obligations ever supersede our need for survival? Is the person who disappears always a victim, or can they also be an architect of their own escape? And when someone who's been lost is finally found, should the reunion be joyful, or does the complexity of the situation make that impossible? These are questions that philosophers and therapists and families everywhere have to grapple with. The case was closed by official standards. The mystery was solved, the missing person was found, but in another sense the case was never solved at all. Because the real questions were never forensic. They were deeply, fundamentally human. Detective Sarah Chin, who conducted the final interviews, concluded, "This case taught me that not all disappearances are crimes. Some are acts of survival. Some are people trying to break free from lives that are suffocating them. And sometimes when we find the missing person, they don't want to be found. And that's the most difficult truth of all." In the end, the story of Jade Harper is a story about the complexity of human choice. It's a story about a girl who was drowning and made a choice to save herself, even if that choice meant hurting everyone who loved her. It's a story about survival and cost and the way that sometimes the person who disappears is trying to stay alive, not trying to hurt the people left behind. The mystery is solved. Jade Harper is alive. She's in Portland, building a life, continuing her work as Morgan Chase, processing the reunion with her family, trying to figure out how to live as someone who is both a victim and a survivor, both a daughter and someone who had to leave her daughter nest behind. And Detective Morrison, the man who spent 17 years obsessed with finding her, finally has his answer. But answers, he learned, are rarely as satisfying as we hope they'll be. "I found the girl," Morrison said. "But in finding her, I learned that sometimes the most important discoveries don't bring closure. They bring understanding. And understanding is heavier in its way than mystery ever was." This is the story of Jade Harper. A girl who disappeared. A woman who emerged. And the complicated truth that sometimes the missing don't want to be found, and the found don't want to come home. Morgan Chase, the name she kept, the identity she'd built, continued her life in Portland. She returned to podcasting, but now with a different kind of visibility. She was the woman who'd disappeared, the cold case that was solved, the girl who'd chosen to disappear and become someone new. Some listeners celebrated her. Others condemned her. Most were simply curious, trying to understand what it meant to disappear and become, to choose survival over obligation. "I'm grateful that my story is out," she said in an interview. "Because maybe it helps other people understand that sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is leave. Sometimes staying is cruelty to yourself. I'm not proud of how I did it. I'm not proud of the pain I caused. But I'm proud that I survived. That I became someone who could actually live instead of just perform." The case of Jade Harper's disappearance raises questions that have no easy answers. At what point does someone have the right to disappear? What are the obligations we have to people who love us, and do those obligations ever supersede our need for survival? Is the person who disappears always a victim, or can they also be an architect of their own escape? And when someone who's been lost is finally found, should the reunion be joyful, or does the complexity of the situation make that impossible? These are questions that philosophers and therapists and families everywhere have to grapple with. The case was closed by official standards. The mystery was solved, the missing person was found, but in another sense the case was never solved at all. Because the real questions were never forensic. They were deeply, fundamentally human. Detective Sarah Chin, who conducted the final interviews, concluded, "This case taught me that not all disappearances are crimes. Some are acts of survival. Some are people trying to break free from lives that are suffocating them. And sometimes when we find the missing person, they don't want to be found. And that's the most difficult truth of all." In the end, the story of Jade Harper is a story about the complexity of human choice. It's a story about a girl who was drowning and made a choice to save herself, even if that choice meant hurting everyone who loved her. It's a story about survival and cost and the way that sometimes, the person who disappears is trying to stay alive, not trying to hurt the people left behind. The mystery is solved. Jade Harper is alive. She's in Portland, building a life, continuing her work as Morgan Chase, processing the reunion with her family, trying to figure out how to live as someone who is both a victim and a survivor, both a daughter and someone who had to leave her daughter nest behind. And Detective Morrison, the man who spent 17 years obsessed with finding her, finally has his answer. But answers, he learned, are rarely as satisfying as we hope they'll be. "I found the girl," Morrison said. "But in finding her, I learned that sometimes the most important discoveries don't bring closure. They bring understanding. And understanding is heavier in its way than mystery ever was." This is the story of Jade Harper. A girl who disappeared. A woman who emerged. And the complicated truth that sometimes, the missing don't want to be found, and the found don't want to come home.